Today's hearing will focus on a proposed regulation by the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council and the Council on Environmental Quality that would require federal contractors to disclose greenhouse gas emissions and set reduction targets. The rule would require that a London-based company validate those targets. That UK company, an entity named Science-Based Target Initiative, or SBTi, would act as a quasi-regulator by performing a fundamentally governmental task of setting emission reduction targets and then validating those same targets. This committee held a hearing in September where we heard from various stakeholders about the impact that this proposed rule would have on industry and about their concerns with the selection of SBTi to perform a quasi-regulatory role. However, today's hearing is not about the propriety of the proposed regulation. Instead, this hearing will examine the process that has been proposed to enact the regulation and on the selection of SBTi to perform this role. I think that we all would agree that one of the primary responsibilities of Congress in conducting oversight is to ensure that government functions in a way that is fair to everybody. Doing so requires that the government remove even the appearance of conflicts of interest from decision-making and conduct itself as transparently as possible. I'd like to emphasize that this hearing is not about climate change or whether companies should or should not reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Today's hearing is about government overreach and a questionable process that could result in the government picking winners and losers in the marketplace. I'd like to highlight some of my concerns with this process. The FAR Council, which is comprised of NASA, the GSA, and the DoD, published a proposed rule last November which decreed that all major federal contractors would be required to set greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets and then be obligated to hire a specific private foreign company to validate those targets. The company chosen by the administration to perform this task was SBTi. This committee has had difficulty in establishing the basis for the selection of SBTi to fill this critical role. We do know that NASA, a member of the FAR Council, confirmed that they had no communication with SBTi either before or after the drafting of the proposed rule. According to documents provided by OMB, representatives from OMB met to discuss this proposed regulation only twice. There was no other email traffic, no formal vetting or application, no competitive process, and it appears SBTi did not even have to submit a single piece of paper explaining why they were best suited for this job. We don't know what vetting was performed by the CEQ because they refused to provide this committee with the answers to our questions or any of the documents that we've requested. It's important for the American people to understand the process used to select SBTi and to craft this regulation because there appears to be serious conflicts of interest between the administration and SBTi. SBTi is a London-based company that lists the We Mean Business Coalition as one of its primary owners. That coalition was launched by the New Venture Fund, which is owned and operated by Arbella Advisors. According to multiple news articles, Arbella is one of the top donors to numerous political candidates and causes. We also know that at least one senior White House official previously partnered with the Arbella Advisors to launch an organization that advocated for some of the same policy that now appears in this proposed regulation. Now, let me be clear here. There is nothing wrong with advocating for a policy goal and then going to work in an administration to implement that goal. It happens in every administration. However, there is a big difference between implementing a policy that you've advocated for and using the government to steer money, power, and influence to your former employer. That is not okay. If this is in fact what has happened here, then everybody on this committee, regardless of political party, should agree that this is wrong. And that's regardless of who might be in the White House. As members of Congress, we have an obligation to safeguard the power of the legislative branch as the ultimate grantor of regulatory authority and to reject attempts to usurp that authority by the executive branch, regardless of whether or not we otherwise support the current administration. The American people deserve answers on this issue. They need to know how and why this proposed regulation came to be and why SBTi was selected in what appears to be a non-competitive single-source process. I hope that today's hearing will provide those answers. Today's witness is Mr. Andrew Mayock, Chief Sustainability Officer for the Council on Environmental Quality, which was intimately involved in the drafting of this proposed rule. Mr. Rayoc, thank you for your willingness to be here. I hope that your testimony today will provide answers to the committee's concerns and also offer some much-needed transparency on this issue. So, Mr. Mayock, in March, we sent you a letter, the CEQ a letter, requesting the rationale for the selection of SBTi and the production of some documents. And I'm very disappointed that we haven't had a response from the CEQ on that letter. Can you tell us why the CEQ has not responded?
I know that my CEQ colleagues have been working diligently to be responsive to that letter and to gather documents responsive to that letter. I know that part of the process which ends up taking time includes interagency review for agencies that have equities in documents to produce. I have that own disappointment with delay in the interagency process, Mr. Chairman. And I'm pleased to report today that it's my understanding that these documents will be produced in days, not weeks, and we look forward to making good on a response to that letter.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that. Let me also express a little bit of disappointment with your testimony. We had specifically asked you to testify on the subjects of the selection of SBTi as the validator and the setter of these reductions targets and the process by which they were selected. And you barely touched on SBTi at all in your testimony. So can you please elaborate as to how SBTi was selected to fill this role?
Yes, thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. In addressing the question of, couple points up front, Mr. Chairman. One is I do want to emphasize the status of this as a proposed rule. It was November a year ago that the Biden-Harris administration put the rule out in the Federal Register as a proposed rule to gain comment from the public. The Biden-Harris administration had the rule out for a 3-month time period. Were requested to extend that time period, extended that time period, and have received thousands of comments.
Sure. So how was SBTi selected to be part of that rule?
Yes. So in the selection itself and the development of policy when it comes to third-party standards, I think it's important to take a step back and understand the use of third-party standards, of which SBTi
No, sir, I understand, and that we're talking about SBTi, not the propriety of setting standards. So how was SBTi selected? Were there multiple applicants?
Well, in the identification of the third-party standards that are in the proposed FAR rule, there was extensive stakeholder outreach to seek, basically to find what is the leading and most widely used standard when it comes to science-based targets. And when it comes to science-based targets and when it comes to these other targets, what you find is that 6,000 companies globally used SBTi as a nonprofit organization to set this standard and guide this standard. And those 6,000 companies represent 1/3 of global market capitalization. And so
you're saying
policy review process,
the third parties are the ones that recommended SBTi. Did you ever contact SBTi? Did you ask for other people to apply? Did you have meetings with them?
Well, just to be clear, the identification of any of the standards that were under review took place by taking a look at all standards.
No, sir. I'm not asking about the standards. I'm asking about the entity that was selected to enforce those standards, to set the standards and enforce them.
Yes, and I'm talking about the same thing in that SBTi is the third-party standard bearer. Mm-hmm. And when looking at what are the leading third-party standard organizations when it comes to science-based targets, SBTi far and away is the most widely used and the leading standard. So that was the question that was put before our office and other offices as the policy advisors to the FAR Council.
So let me ask you a different question then. Did you consider, since this is a quasi-regulatory rule, did you consider empowering an agency of the federal government, for example, the EPA, to provide those services? Because doing that as opposed to a private business would have had some pretty powerful benefits. businesses would be afforded due process, they'd have appeal rights, none of which exists when you delegate this to a private company. So did you consider the EPA?
I know in that the EPA, again, the primary question was, who is the leading standard? What is the most widely used standard? And the EPA, not to my knowledge, does science-based targets.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for your responses. I'm looking forward to CEQ actually producing the documents that we asked for in March. And I want to remind my colleagues that we asked the White House to send someone. They sent Mr. Mayock. So anyone that's interested in talking to the FAR Council, they had an opportunity to be here today and elected not to. But I look forward to continuing our discussion, Mr. Mayock. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
That concludes our questioning. I'd like to thank all of the members of the subcommittees for their questions. Mr. Mayock, I'd also like to thank you very much for being here and for your testimony. 2 points I'd like to make briefly as we close here. The first is that we here in Congress have a constitutional obligation to perform oversight. That oversight role does not have to be adversarial, but making it non-adversarial requires transparency and responsiveness. So I'm looking forward to receiving the results of our inquiry back in March within, as you say, days, not weeks, hopefully. The second point is that there is a big difference between adopting a third-party standard and requiring U.S. companies to contract with a third party to validate and enforce that standard. You have said several times today that the rule that we're talking about is not a final rule, and so I am in hopes that you will take our concerns about the selection of SBTi and the role that that company would play in this process back to your agency and the administration and seriously consider it as this rule is finalized. The record will remain open for 10 additional days for comments and written questions from members. And with that, this committee meeting is adjourned.